Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Russia, because as you know, and I'll remind you that yesterday, according to information we have, according to details that were provided by the Russians, by the Americans and by the Ukrainians, yesterday on the 26th of March of 2025, the Russians signed the deal of the century, probably the best deal ever that the Russians signed since the beginning probably of 20th and 21st century, and this deal will allow the Russians to earn billions of dollars. Furthermore, according to information we have, according to Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States of America, he said that the list of conditions put forward by the Russian Federation for a moratorium on strikes in the Black Sea includes the lifting of sanctions imposed by Europe. This is very important because I'll remind you that the European Union and the European countries arrested Russian assets, and according to information we have, by the beginning of 2025 there were around 200 billion arrested or frozen assets of the Russian Federation that are located in the European banks, and the US authorities say that now European Union should lift these sanctions. But we see that the European Union is not ready to lift any sanctions. At least we came to this conclusion based on the statements and words that were made by Macron. It's too early to discuss lifting sanctions on Russia. That was stated by Macron, and in additional, Macron reported and stated about additional 2 billion military aid package to Ukraine. So we see that the European Union continue their own personal war with the Russian Federation. Also, Macron stated that the peacekeeping force the West wants to send to Ukraine would be able to give a military response if they were attacked, most likely by the Russians. Anyway, despite all these things that are coming, negative things first of all, that are coming from the European Union, despite the things that Zelensky doesn't want to finish this war, doesn't want to end this special military operation, we see, and most likely the year of 2025 is going to be a year of the Russian Federation. Once again, because the Russians will earn so much money this upcoming year, so it's very even difficult to imagine the exact amount of money the Russians will get during the 2025. And we're talking not about the lifting of the sanctions, we're talking not about the let's say adding Russia back to SWIFT, we're talking just about the regular things. For example, today several pro-Russian sources reported that when Western companies return to Russia, and I believe that when is not a very good word for this, I believe that's not just when, but if are not even if the Western countries are already begun process to return back to Russia, the authorities will take into account whether these firms provided assistance to the Ukrainian armed forces, especially publicly. So we see that the Russians even will filter Western companies that will probably send signals that they have some desire to restore their companies and their activities on the territory of the Russian Federation. The Russians will not allow companies that were involved in supporting of Ukraine to return back to the territory of the Russian Federation. We need to understand one important thing, that the Russian market is huge, and obviously some European countries, especially German companies, like companies that specialized on building and production cars and vehicles, could probably restore their positions in the global market if they were allowed to return back to the territory of the Russian Federation. Obviously, Russian market can fix a lot of problems of the European Union. Another important statement, for example, some European countries, some world companies began this process to return back to Russia. And for example, probably the most important example is Google. Google itself losses billions in Russia. The company paid about 40% of fines. This is 3.5 billion rubles. The total amount amount of fines is 32.8 billion rubles. Since 2021, the federal let's say service have recovered 3.4 billion rubles from Google's Russia subsidiary. This is about 40% of the total amount of fines imposed on company, and in total it had to pay 32.8 billion rubles. The money was recovered from the fact that Google violated Russian laws, and the bailiffs continued to work to receive the remaining amount. So we see that Google, despite the sanctions, despite the fact that Google left the territory of Russian Federation, we see that they're paying their debts, which means that they're paying their debts because they understand that most likely sooner or later they will have to return back to the territory of Russia and to the Russian market. But for example, when talking about the Shell, the company Shell, which has the roots from the United Kingdom, we see that there are some problems in this company. For example, Russia demands Shell to compensate Gazprom 1.5 billion and plans to confiscate most of the money from existing assets. So we see that the company like Shell, the entrance to the Russian market for the company as Shell, we see was closed by the Russians, and most likely this company will not be able to return to the Russian market in the very near future, but obviously their competitors, main competitors, will be able to do this. So we see that the Russians will get a lot of money this year. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. During the previous nights, the Russians chose 2 more cities to attack. I'll remind you that since the 18th of February of March of 2025, the Russians made massive drone attack in Odessa and Zaporozhye. Then the Russians attacked the city of Kiev. But as for the previous night, the main explosions took place on the territory of the city of Dnipro. In these photos, we can see the consequences of Russian drone attack. The city was completely covered with fire. We have a lot of videos where we can see explosions as a result of Russian drone strikes. One video, as you can see, this one is blurred, but see here we can see a very big explosion that happened after the Russians attacked the city of Dnipro. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians bombed the city of Kharkiv. In this video we can see how during the evening period of time some people playing football, and then at some moments we can see a very heavy explosion somewhere in the vicinity of the football field. And this is another angle. This is the explosion from another angle. The Russians reported that as a result of strikes several ammo depots were destroyed. Some sources reported that they managed to count up to 10 explosions. So now it's very difficult even to understand what kind of city the Russians will choose for the next night. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation along the line of combat contact. And first let's talk about the Sumy direction, where the Russians continue their attempts to force Ukrainians to completely abandon their positions on the territory of the Russian Federation. And during the previous 24 hours we have several changes on map. Let's take a look and let's compare the map between the dates. This is the situation by the end of the 26th of March. As you can see, there were several reports that the Russians entered the checkpoint along the border and that the Russians improved their positions to the west of Milovoy. And today we see that the Russians continue improving their positions to the west of Milovoy by approaching closer and closer to the settlement of Oleshnya. And the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of Gogolevka. So we see that the Russians continue. There are still lots of job to do, but the Russians are getting closer and closer to this final day. Another important update is coming from the settlement of Guevo, and today both the pro-Russian resources and the group of forces north and the different pro-Russian mappers adjusted the map, saying that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to enter the northern part of the settlement of Guevo. So currently the clashes are taking place already on the territory of this village. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Belgorod direction, where the Ukrainians, after a very short regrouping, began another waves of attacks towards the settlement of Demidovka and Popovka. The source reported that Ukrainians continue their attempts to break through the Russian border and to take under control these villages. And today we got very important videos published by the Russian side. In this video we can see how the Ukrainians destroyed one bridge, and here we can see how the Ukrainians destroyed another bridge. When talking about the map, so this is the first bridge that was destroyed, and this is the second one. If we take a look at the map, and if we take a look at the main supply roads, we're gonna see that there are two roads through the village of Nadezhevka and through the village of Grafovka that go in the direction of the settlements like Romanovka, Demidovka, and Popovka. So now the Ukrainians realize that they haven't managed to probably break through to, let's say, to break the Russian spirit and to break the Russian defense. So that's why the Ukrainians decided, first of all, to destroy logistic and then probably to make another attempt. So we will most likely during the next days we're going to receive lots of updates from this area. Now let's move further. Very important updates are coming from the Lyman direction of the southern Kupiansk one. According to information we have, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to improve their positions and to clear the settlement of Terny. As for different mappers, as for pro-Russian resources, as for neutral resources, the Russians established control over this village a long time ago, and furthermore the Russians already secured the village of Yampolovka. But just today the pro-Ukrainian resources confirmed this. Furthermore, pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed additional breakthrough of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in the direction of the settlement by the name of Katerinovka. Furthermore, several sources reported that this morning on the 27th of March of 2025, the first sabotage and reconnaissance group of the armed forces of the Russian Federation entered this village. So, summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that currently the Russians managed to establish complete control over this territory, over everything inside of this red line, which means that Ukrainian defense belted, which means that the dense network of Ukrainian fortifications between all these settlements was cut in two. So the Russians managed to dig deeper between these two positions, and we expect that if this information is correct, if this information is true regarding Russian progress and breakthrough in this area, we believe that during the next 672 hours this entire line will collapse, and most likely the southern Kupiansk direction and the Lyman direction itself will collapse automatically as well. And then most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to show the Russians any resistance and to stop them, because the situation here is very critical, and not just critical, it's become incredibly dangerous for the Ukrainians. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction. Today several mappers reported that the Russians finished the battle for the settlement of Panteley-Manievka. This information was provided us by neutral mappers and by pro-Russian resources. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the salient in the vicinity of the city of Pokrovsk. There are very very difficult situation for the Russians. The Russians have lots of problems with logistic, and today, according to information we have, the Ukrainians managed to secure the village of Kotlina completely. This territory used to be considered as a territory under complete Russian control, but Ukrainians reported that during the previous 24 hours they managed to secure the village, and now the Ukrainians are trying to stabilize the situation, and then the Ukrainians most likely will continue their offensive operation in the direction of Vovkova. I'll remind you that several days ago the Ukrainians, according to Ukrainian sources and neutral sources, managed to attack the village of Salona and also to answer the western part. And now we see that the Ukrainians are trying to create a cauldron for the armed forces of Ukraine that are currently located inside of this, let's say, pocket inside of this area. Furthermore, we believe and we expect that this upcoming day the Ukrainians will resume their attempts to counterattack in the direction of the settlement by the name of Pishchana. The Ukrainians during the previous months made lots of attempts to counterattack this area, and for some period of time they managed to even restore control over this village almost completely, but then the Russians regrouped, counterattacked, and forced the Ukrainians to fall back, and the Russians stabilized the situation later. But now, from this configuration, due to Ukrainian attack from the north, due to additional progress from the west, we believe that now it's clear that Ukrainians during the next 48 hours will counterattack in this area as well. The main purpose of the Ukrainians for this stage of defense operation is to cut the salient completely, to restore supply supply and support of the city of Pokrovsk, which will allow the Ukrainians to improve their logistic of the city of Konstantinovka, because the general battle for the Konstantinovka-Slaviansk agglomeration is going to start very soon. Furthermore, the Ukrainians established certain FPV drone control over the main supply lines of the Russians in the vicinity of Novotroitska. So the Ukrainians are using the tactics that the Russians use also on different directions. Several pro-Russian resources reported that due to this critical situation, the Russians tried to find some solution how to stabilize the area, and according to different sources, the Russians managed to outflank the village of Uspenovka, and the Russians answered the next village to the village of Uspenovska, the settlement of Novoalexandriivka. So some maneuvers of like this was carried out by the Russians. At least this information was provided by several pro-Russian resources. So summarizing everything, most likely, and according to different pro-Russian resources, by the beginning of the 27th of March, the Russians established control over this territory. This will allow the Russians to reduce the pressure on the western flank. So the Russians understand the value of this area, and obviously they will try to save control over this territory despite the price they may be forced to pay for this. As for the South Donetsk direction, according to different sources, the Russians answered the eastern part of the settlement of Rozliv. We're waiting for additional updates, geolocations, or any proofs, and if we receive them, we will adjust the map. But obviously this is a very interesting report. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of Volne Polya. This information today was confirmed by neutral mappers. There are very heavy clashes for the rest of the settlement, and according to information we have, the Russians carry out very interesting maneuver and attack the village of Veselya from the east, and also the Russians answered the settlement from this side, and currently there are also very heavy clashes for this territory. So let's wait and see what is going to be next. But obviously if both villages fall in Russian hands, then most likely during the next 2-3 weeks we will adjust the map and color everything inside of this red line in the Russian favor, and the Russians will be able to shorten the distance to the Dnipro region for probably 1 kilometer or even less. The Russians improved their positions in the Zaporozhye direction by taking additional territories under control around the settlement of Lobkova. This information was provided us by the neutral mappers. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds you, you can condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.